that nothing happens for free. The villagers looked at the young gentleman in horror. Xavier grabbed his head, gritting his teeth, thinking to hell with him. He no longer understood what was good and what was bad. The brown-haired man looked at the man who had approached him and called out to him. The villager looked at the young gentleman with a serious look, asking that if he signed the contract, he would have a job. The protagonist smiled maliciously, sticking out his tongue. He said that, of course, they would pay a salary and even overtime. The hero looked at the villager with a crazy look, noting that from the moment the contract was signed and the first salary was received, they would have to buy food and everything else with their own money. The villager pressed his lips together. He looked at the young gentleman with a confident look, noting that he did not want to sit on others' necks and was ready to sign the contract. The young gentleman's face twisted into a crazy smile. He noted that he was offering a rather difficult contract in the spirit of capitalism, asking if he was ready. The man asked what capitalism was. A woman approached the protagonist and asked if she could sign the contract. Lloyd noted that they did not discriminate based on gender. People began to line up in front of the protagonist's desk, saying that they also wanted to earn a living for themselves and wanted to sign the contract. The protagonist smirked slightly, noting that they were preparing to launch a project that would provide them with a stable livelihood in their own land. The bright sun shone over the green fields. Lloyd stated that they would start a project to develop terraced farmland. The sunlight illuminated the green meadows. Lloyd noted that with the help of a gabion, they would strengthen the eastern hill and build farmland, and the gabion would be very easy to build from rebar. Belle lay on the bed with an exhausted look. The little beaver looked at the protagonist with fury. The young gentleman noted that Belle worked hard to build the apartment complex. The little beaver hit the protagonist in the face with its paw. The protagonist noted that he would not be able to ask her to work for a while. Tears appeared in the protagonist's eyes. He thought that in that case, a full moon shone in the night sky. A system window appeared to summon a mystical creature. The protagonist stared at the system window, noting that he had been thinking about this idea for several days, but it seemed to be the only way that would allow them to get the materials they needed. White arrows pointed to the start button. The system announced that this was great, and they began to summon, asking what they would get, adding that they only live once. The protagonist narrowed his eyes, thinking that this was a stupid system, and even if he was acting like some kind of rogue, he had always been on his side. Peapodong and Hippo watched with curiosity. Lloyd noted that Peapodong, Hippo, and Belle always got the creature he needed the most. A system window appeared with RP amount of 4783. The young gentleman noted that since he had a large reserve of RP, there was no reason to doubt and it was time to begin. The main character swung his finger furiously. He said for it to show itself, a creature that would help him get reinforcement for retaining walls. The protagonist pressed his finger on start. A magic circle appeared in the air. The protagonist folded his hands in front of the magic circle. Confused words were heard from the circle. Lloyd noted how noisy it was. The magic circle increased in size. The brown-haired man watched what was happening, dumbfounded, not understanding what it was. A pillar of fire struck the protagonist's face from the magic circle. The protagonist looked ahead in bewilderment with his mouth wide open. Lloyd glared at the system window. The system announced that it was called a donut hole. The young gentleman glared at the system window, asking that it was not on his side. A system window appeared. He announced that he was just a system that followed certain rules and they did not take sides. The young gentleman told him to change his businesslike tone. The protagonist's hands shook with anger, asking then what about all the other creatures, because he was giving him exactly what he needed. The system began to laugh maliciously. The protagonist looked at the system in bewilderment. The system emitted a terrifying aura when it laughed maliciously. The protagonist looked at the system window in confusion. The system announced that he was such a pathetic fool and apparently he still hadn't gotten it. Lloyd's eyes widened, glaring at the system. The system said that this was the whole point of gambling. It gave the newbie a few wins and then made them wait for the next success. The protagonist said that then he was a real swindler and he would kill him. The system asked him what he thought the world would make his life easier, adding that he shouldn't dare think that everything was that simple. The protagonist gritted his teeth in displeasure. The author noted that this is the type of person who quickly agrees with the villain's logic. The white arrows pointed to the system start window. The system asked what could happen next time, what would be worthwhile. The protagonist pressed the start button with a sly grin. Not far from the estate, a fiery explosion occurred. The protagonist began to wave his fists. The system asked him to wait a minute, adding that God loves the Trinity. The protagonist pressed the start button again. Lloyd fell to the ground, covering his head with his hands, when a magical green circle appeared. The young gentleman asked him what he thought. He was such a fool that he would let himself be fooled 3 times. The author noted that he had already been fooled. The young gentleman closed his eyes and gritted his teeth, after which he opened one eye, seeing a bright light. A terrifying huge monster appeared from the magic circle. The protagonist along with Hippo and Peepodong suddenly ran away from the monster. Brown-haired ran up to the knight, pointing his hand at the monster. The swordsman cut the monster with his blade. The protagonist sat on the ground with heavy breathlessness. Brown-haired looked at the system window in rage. The system notified that he had failed. Lloyd said that he already understood and would not try again. System notifications appeared. Hidden necessity reached, bankruptcy, his body and RP were severely damaged due to 3 consecutive failures. As compensation for his losses, the choice of the skill of the mystical creature became available to him. Brown-haired looked at the system notification in surprise, wondering what kind of skill he had. Many system windows appeared in front of the young master. The system notified that this was a list of skills that can be selected. The main character's eyes widened in surprise. He thought that this couldn't be true and why there were only 3 useful skills. System windows with skills appeared, such as becoming a crybaby, meditating, nature lover, and so on. The protagonist studied the skills with curiosity, after which his gaze fell on the skill of launching a spider web. He wondered what spider web was there. The brown-haired man thoughtfully looked away, imagining a spider on a web. He noted that if its weave was strong enough, they would get a material that would be stronger in stretchability and elasticity than metal, and it was resistant to moisture and would not lose its strength even after a long stay in the sun. The protagonist grinned sarcastically, noting that here it was and he knew that he would get exactly what he wanted. A system window appeared about summoning a mystical creature. The system asked that he would like to choose this skill and summon a mystical creature. RP quantity 4070. The main character pressed the start button, saying that he chose to launch a spider web. A green magic circle appeared in the air. A bright glow began to emanate from it. The sunlight illuminated the room of the estate. Xavier sat in a chair, hugging a pillow. He slightly opened his eyes, noting that, apparently, he dreamed something very strange. The sun was shining brightly over the fields. The workers looked up at the sky with curiosity, asking what it was. A black silhouette was visible in the sky. The men looked up in surprise. White feathers fell down to the ground. The man asked what an angel was. The protagonist smiled widely, shouting that it was gorgeous and they needed to do another lap around the county. The young gentleman was riding a huge jigoming bird. The guys flew over the workers who were raising their shovels. The man said that this was Mr. Lloyd and a mystical creature that flies through time. The protagonist stood on the bird, spreading his arms out to the sides. The workers shouted that Mr. Lloyd was a good man. The protagonist noted that he expected to see a spider, so he was a little scared when he saw a carrier pigeon, but birds have one big advantage. The brown-haired man with a serious expression on his face was riding a pigeon. The worker shouted that Mr. Lloyd was flying in the sky, and he was looking down on them. The men shouted that they completely trusted him. The protagonist noted that he could show off in front of the people as much as he wanted and strengthen their loyalty. The brown-haired man grinned maliciously, thinking that this way he could increase the amount of work and make them pay taxes, adding that this was a jackpot. The protagonist imagined a disgruntled pigeon. He noted that Jigoming's main skill was to shoot spider webs, and its secondary skills were to stretch the web, weave a nest, and throw droppings. The protagonist imagined a web coming out of the backpack. He noted that Jigoming could shoot webs from the backpack on his back. The brown-haired man recalled how he tried to stretch the web, noting that he tried to tear it with mana rings, but he only managed to stretch it a little, noting that this was the perfect quality. The young master pointed a shovel to Jigoming, saying that they were flying to a plateau. Lloyd imagined a web net on the ground, saying that with his skill, they would be able to weave a powerful net. Jigoming narrowed his gaze and sighed heavily. The protagonist noted that everything was good about this bird, but Lloyd looked at the pigeon in bewilderment. The huge bird flew away. The young master asked where it went. The pigeon landed with a crash on the ground, after which Jigoming threw the protagonist off his back. The brown-haired man fell to the ground. He grabbed his nose angrily, looking at the pigeon, asking what it was doing. Lloyd noted that he was an asshole. The pigeon sprawled near a tree, putting a branch in its beak. Jigoming slightly narrowed his gaze, stroking his body with his wings. He said in his own language that it pissed him off. Lloyd noted that he was incredibly lazy. The protagonist held his broken nose, angrily looking at the bird, wondering how to make it work. The protagonist squatted opposite the pigeon. Last night, Lloyd looked at Jigoming with a smile, asking him that he could release a web and if he could show him what kind of web it was. The pigeon turned its head to the side, sighing heavily, after which it plopped down on the ground. Jigoming looked away with an indifferent look, speaking in his own language, asking why he cared about him and why he bothered to work and live a hard worker's life. The young master looked at the bird with narrowed eyes. He thought that just looking at this bastard, wondering that he was acting rather strangely. Peepodong approached his new friend with a wide smile. He smiled happily, raising his paws up. The rodent said that it was to create an infrastructure for society to improve the quality of life for people, experience satisfaction and receive rewards. Ji Goming stared at the rodent. Pi Podong said in his own language that it was to create his own worldview to become a creature that brings happiness to this world. The little bird raised his eyebrows slightly. He slightly opened his beak, saying that he would try it then. Brown-haired noted that Pi Podong's words had motivated him in general, and he began to move in a sense. The protagonist stood with his back to the sprawled pigeon. He noted that it had returned to that state again. A rodent crawled out from under his shirt. It approached the bird, suggesting that they try a little more together. Ji Goming looked away, saying that after thinking about it carefully, he found no reason to try so hard. The protagonist watched the bird with bewilderment. The pigeon noted that the world would continue to move on even if they just sat and did nothing, and since he had summoned it, it would still feed it and take care of it. The protagonist's face twisted in rage. He thought that he was really annoying him, and maybe he should make dinner out of it, wondering if he could just eat it. Pi Podong looked at the pigeon with displeasure, waving his paws, saying that it was impossible to say that. Ji Goming looked at the rodent with bewilderment. Then he spat out a branch towards the animal. The stick hit the rodent on the head. The protagonist stood with his back in bewilderment, watching what was happening. The animal looked back at the young master, turning to him. Lloyd agreed with the animal. Then he handed the almond to Pi Podong. White clouds floated over the mountains. The birds flew into the air. Ji Goming began to frantically flap his wings, flying away from the forest. Pi Podong grabbed the pigeon by the paw. The rodent increased in size, grabbing the bird. Then he began to push the pigeon into his mouth. Lloyd watched what was happening, dumbfounded. Pi Podong was pushing the bird into his mouth. The sky was clear. Ji Goming lay exhausted on the ground in a pool of drool. Pi Podong looked at the bird with a happy expression, asking how he liked it and if he wanted to play some more. The pigeon looked at the rodent in horror, saying that he wanted to work. Pi Podong smiled maliciously, his eyes flashing red. The protagonist smiled furiously, giving a thumbs up. Lloyd noted that no matter where or when, threats always work best. The workers were digging the ground. The protagonist noted that step 1 was to dig a slope. Baibong was shaking a tray of sand furiously. Lloyd noted that step 2 was to make Baibong filter the best sand through a huge sieve. Ji Goming flew through the sky, releasing a web from his backpack. A net of webs formed on the ground. The protagonist noted that step 3 was to make Ji Goming weave a web in the form of rebar. Pi Podong sat on the pigeon's beak, hitting it with his paw. The young gentleman noted that step 4 was support from the person in charge. The rodent said how weak he was. The protagonist flew by on a huge bird, telling the white warriors to move forward. The workers shed tears, raising their shovels, shouting that they were Lloyd's warriors. The workers began to fill the web mesh with sand. The young gentleman noted that step 5 was to cover the web mesh with sand and continue this process until the backfill was complete. The workers leveled the ground. The protagonist noted that step 6 was after creating the stability of the backfill, filling it from all sides, vigorously filling the gabion with pebbles and gravel. White arrows pointed to the web mesh. The brown-haired man watched the workers from the air, noting that they had completed the first stage. The men shouted that they were Lloyd's warriors. The brown-haired man grinned, noting that they would probably be done by spring if they could distribute the land to the refugees and extend the construction time for the buildings, then finish everything by next year. The protagonist raised his shovel. He bared his teeth, standing astride the bird. Lloyd noted that this would be the end of his working life. An unemployed, carefree and rich life was already waiting for him. The men continued digging the earth. Arcus and Bayern sat at the table with a pile of papers. The bright sun was shining over the green fields with flowers. The system announced that the production of terraced farmland in Frontera County was complete. The bright sun illuminated the blocks of earth. The system announced that he had become one of the best builders on the continent, bonus RP plus 800, RP 4070. The protagonist lay on a green meadow with flowers in his hands. The system